I was recently looking into a provincial government office in Anhui, China. They were going through their procurement list for new AI hardware. And if you're a tech enthusiast, you know the standard play. You want the fastest, most energy-efficient chips on the planet, usually NVIDIA. But instead, they did something that would make a Western CFO's head spin. They intentionally chose domestic chips from companies like Huawei and Cambricon processors that are objectively slower, less energy efficient, and frankly, a massive headache to integrate. On the surface, it looked like a total failure of logic. Why pay more for a tool that does less? Why accept a performance deficit and a higher operational cost? But as I watched how this played out, I realized this wasn't a bureaucratic mistake. It was a cold, calculated trade-off being executed at a regional level. They were essentially paying a performance penalty today to buy strategic optionality tomorrow. While the rest of the world is obsessed with cost per unit and immediate return on investment, they were explicitly subsidizing their own learning curve and guaranteeing a market for a domestic supplier. Contrast that choice, that willingness to accept inefficiency, with a typical executive meeting in Brussels or Berlin. There, the conversation is almost entirely about regulation, compliance, and hair-splitting cost efficiency. We pride ourselves on being united in spending, seeking the maximum value for every euro. Yet we remain completely divided in thinking when it comes to long-term industrial policy. We chase the cheapest, most efficient compute available globally, rarely stopping to ask what we're giving up in exchange for that immediate cost savings. There's a specific line that stuck with me when looking at this dilemma. Cheap compute can be the most expensive dependency. It left me wondering, is Europe's deep-seated obsession with immediate operational efficiency actually its greatest strategic weakness? We think we're winning because our systems are streamlined, our costs are low, but we might just be building ourselves a very comfortable cage. The real lock-in isn't just the physical hardware you buy, it's the software, the operational habits, and the specialized talent that get baked in long before the chip is even installed. If a high-level government office can't even imagine choosing a worse product for a better sovereign reason, have we already lost the structural ability to lead in the next generation of industry?
That Anhui example, choosing the objectively slower domestic chip, it really captures the central tension we're diving into today.
Really does.
It just crystallizes this fundamental difference in strategic priorities. On one side, you've got the drive for short-term cost efficiency and, frictionless global trade, the common Western model.
Right.
And on the other, there's this strategic imperative of long-term technological self-reliance, of sovereignty, which requires you to accept immediate inefficiency as a necessary investment. The choice isn't just economic, it's profoundly geopolitical.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got some amazing material to work with here, from detailed policy analysis outlining China's massive state funding mechanisms to comparative studies that really map out Europe's much more fragmented regulatory path toward its tech goals. So our mission today is to really get into the exact strategic frameworks that are underpinning China's determination to prioritize self-reliance, even at a high initial cost. And then we need to compare that directly with the European focus on efficiency, on internal market protection and regulation, to really understand the structural differences that lead to such opposite decisions.
Exactly. And we should probably start by looking at the blueprint that mandates this self-reliance. That decision in Anhui wasn't improvised. It flows directly from these codified, unified national strategies that treat technology independence as a security issue, not just another market opportunity.
The highest level of policy for this strategic shift seems to be the dual circulation strategy, or DCS, introduced around 2020. How does this overarching policy framework really set the stage for mandating domestic chips?
So the dual circulation strategy is essentially China's new development paradigm. It's a fundamental shift in economic thinking that really came about as global trade tensions started to rise.
Right.
And the aim is dual. First, you strengthen the domestic market, what they call internal circulation, and boost internal growth. And second, you reduce the economy's reliance on foreign economies and external demand, the external circulation.
So it's about building up the home front first.
Precisely. And the primary goal that comes from this is clear. Create a self-sufficient economy, especially in critical high-tech industries like semiconductors and advanced manufacturing. So for that government official in Anhui, choosing the domestic chip is a direct, measurable contribution to strengthening that internal circulation. It proves the domestic ecosystem is viable, even if it's, currently less convenient.
I see. It's a systemic de-risking strategy. It sounds like DCS took the baton from earlier, perhaps more internationally focused policies like Made in China 2025.
Yeah.
How did MIC 25 lay the groundwork for this deep focus on self-sufficiency?
Made in China 2025, which was launched back in 2015, is really the undeniable industrial predecessor to all of this. It was a hugely ambitious industrial policy. The goal was explicit: transform China from being the world's factory, a low-cost manufacturer, into a global leader in high-value advanced manufacturing.
And it targeted very specific sectors.
It did. 10 specific high-tech sectors, including robots, new energy vehicles or NEVs, and most critically for a conversation, semiconductors.
And while MIC 25 drew a lot of international criticism, which prompted the government to sort of dial back the public branding.
Exactly. The MIC 25 brand officially faded from public view around 2018, but its core objectives, enhancing domestic innovation, hitting high domestic market share targets in these technologies, and ultimately reducing reliance on foreign tech, they didn't disappear.
You just got rebranded.
They just continued under alternative, less provocative frameworks, things like high-quality growth and now the dominant dual circulation strategy. So when we talk about this push for self-mastery in semiconductors, we're really talking about a decade-old national ambition that has just been reframed.
So the umbrella is DCS, and the legacy is MIC 25. But the specific granular vehicle driving the semiconductor push, the thing that really compels that Anhui office to navigate the inconvenience of buying Huawei instead of NVIDIA, is the Shenzhuang initiative. For those who aren't familiar, what does that initiative practically mandate?
Right. Shenzhuang, which translates loosely to the Information Innovation Project, is where these high-level policy goals become operational reality.
Boots on the ground.
Exactly. It is the detailed, focused plan for achieving technology independence within the critical information and communication technology, or ICT, sector. This covers software, hardware, operating systems, and crucially, semiconductor technology. It's essentially a government-led directive to swap out all foreign technology for domestic alternatives in critical infrastructure and public sector operations. And what's really fascinating about Shenzhuang is its systematic, phased approach. It's not just about throwing money at the problem. It details a multi-stage, multi-year process targeting advanced process nodes in a very deliberate, engineering-focused way.
Could you walk us through those phases? Are they focused on immediately competing at the leading edge, or is it more of a foundational approach?
It is entirely foundational. The plan acknowledges the domestic technological starting point. It mandated establishing capability at process nodes like 40 nanometers, then moving quickly to 28 nanometers, then 14 millimeter, 12, 10 millimeters, and eventually the more advanced 7 millimeter nodes.
This is not a blind scramble for the most cutting-edge tech.
Not at all. That's incredibly capital-intensive and dominated by just a few global players. This is a roadmap to ensure domestic self-reliance, starting with what's achievable and widely used in legacy systems, industrial applications, and then you systematically advance the complexity up the stack.
And that guarantees they can produce chips for cars, for smart appliances, industrial control.
Military applications, you name it, even if they can't yet produce the most advanced iPhone chips.
So the strategy is, first, secure the foundational technology and the high-volume demand. Second, scale up until your domestic product is good enough. And third, use that scale to subsidize the push to more advanced nodes. And this brings us to what feels like the most powerful tool in this entire strategy, using public procurement to create mandated demand.
That is the absolute key difference. In a purely market-driven economy, if your domestic product is, say, 20% slower or more expensive than the global competitor NVIDIA, in our Anhui example, no one buys it.
And the company dies.
Sure.
Or it never scales up.
Exactly. The strategic use of coordinated public sector demand completely bypasses this initial market failure problem. The state steps in as the guaranteed first customer, ensuring the domestic company gets the volume it needs to move down the cost curve and invest in quality improvements. This coordinated demand ensures these companies can achieve the necessary scale rapidly, overcoming that initial performance gap by subsidizing the learning curve.
I really want to focus on how comprehensive this mandated demand is. This isn't just about one provincial office buying a slightly inferior AI chip. Can you give us some concrete examples of how this policy plays out across key strategic sectors?
Sure. We can start with the directive known as Document 79. This is a very clear mandate. It requires state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, in absolutely critical sectors, finance, energy, transportation, to replace foreign software in their entire IT systems by 2027.
Wow. That's not optional guidance. That's an operational deadline for massive import substitution.
A deadline that affects thousands of organizations. You're forcing them to develop alternatives to foreign giants like Microsoft, Oracle, or SAP in a very compressed time frame.
And I imagine you see the same pattern in core national infrastructure.
Exactly. Telecom carriers, which manage the country's vast networks, were directly instructed to phase out all foreign core network processors completely by 2027.
Which directly impacts major international semiconductor and equipment providers.
It does. They've long supplied critical network hardware. By ensuring that these high-volume critical infrastructure components are sourced domestically, the government guarantees market stabilization for its nascent chip and equipment makers, regardless of any immediate performance trade-offs.
And this extends powerfully into what has become a globally dominant sector for them, the electric vehicle market.
That is perhaps the most visible success story of mandated demand creating essential market traction. The Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, or MIT, which oversees industrial policy, has explicitly urged EV makers, including global leaders like BYD and Geely, to sharply increase their purchases of local chips and to avoid foreign semiconductors whenever possible.
Just think about the strategic weight of that instruction. When the central government tells the world's largest and fastest-growing electric vehicle manufacturers to prioritize local sourcing,
it instantly creates an enormous protected market for domestic chip makers to develop, test, and perfect their automotive semiconductor ecosystems. Automotive chips are highly complex. They require decades of reliability testing. By guaranteeing the demand from the start, the government underwrites the risk of developing these advanced, crucial components. This entire strategy of deliberate, policy-enforced import substitution, driven through procurement and high-level mandates, is the non-negotiable goal of the overall semiconductor strategy. It's creating a closed loop where policy drives demand.
and demand drives scale. So the mandates provide that necessary market demand, effectively de-risking the business model for these domestic companies. But to actually meet that demand, to build the massive fabrication plants, the fabs, you need staggering amounts of capital.
Let's pivot to the scale of financial mobilization here. How large is this capital engine?
The financial commitment is, well, it's truly unprecedented in the history of industrial policy. The initial National Integrated Circuit Plan called for a minimum of $150 billion in direct government subsidies and funding.
$150 billion.
And this capital was mobilized across all levels of government, central, provincial, municipal, and was supplemented by mandatory contributions from state-owned enterprises.
That's a massive figure just to start with. How is this capital structured to ensure it had maximum impact?
The primary vehicle is the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, which most people know as the Big Fund. This functions as the core national investment instrument. The first phase, launched in 2014, raised about $23 billion.
The second phase, started in 2019, raised $29 billion. And signaling an acceleration of this commitment, reports from September 2023 indicated plans for a third, even more extensive fund targeting $41 billion.
That progression, 23, 29, 41 billion, it shows a clear upward trajectory of financial commitment, even with increasing geopolitical headwinds. If you aggregate the total financial force over the last decade, how does that really stack up against the efforts of other major economies?
When you look at the total financial firepower aggregating all the semiconductor sector investments made by Chinese governments at the national, provincial, and city levels, the results are stunning. Analysts suggest that the total annual investment flowing into this sector has been equivalent to the funding level of the entire United States GIPS Act.
Wait.
Virtually every year since 2014.
Let me just make sure I'm processing that. The U.S. GIPS Act was a landmark, multi-year strategic investment. It was designed to revitalize American manufacturing. You're saying China has been operating at that level of commitment year after year for a decade?
That's the estimate. It moves the discussion past comparing one-off funding initiatives. This isn't just a large fund, it's a sustained, decade-long structural flow of capital. They're treating the semiconductor ecosystem not as a competitive market segment, but as critical national infrastructure, much like building a high-speed rail network or electrifying the grid. The persistence and magnitude of that financial commitment are what differentiate this approach.
So this systematic flow of capital must drastically alter the competitive dynamics for the firms on the receiving end. How is this support specifically structured to enable rapid scaling and undercut global competitors? It must be more than just simple grants.
Oh, it is. It focuses heavily on mechanisms that bypass normal market pressures, primarily through below-market equity injections and direct subsidization. There was a detailed study by the OECD that looked at government support given to 21 international semiconductor firms between 2014 and 2018.
And what did they find?
They found that 4 major Chinese firms, Huahong, JSET, SMIC, and Tsinghua Unigroup, received government support in the staggering range of $5 to $15 billion each.
$5 to $15 billion. How does that translate into their operating budget?
The strategic impact is clear when you compare that support to revenue. The total government support received by SMIC and Tsinghua Unigroup actually exceeded 30% of their annual consolidated revenue during that key period of 2014 to 2018.
Over 30% of their revenue coming directly from state support. I mean, that fundamentally changes their pricing structure. They are not competing on the same economic playing field as their global rivals.
They're not. For SMIC, the country's largest foundry, state subsidies accounted for slightly over 40% of its total revenues from 2014 to 2018.
40%.
Yeah. Now, contrast that with major global competitors like TSMC, Intel, or Samsung, where state subsidies you can identify in their financials accounted for, at most, 3% or less of their revenue. This state-directed financial model ensures that these Chinese companies can sustain heavy initial losses, scale production rapidly, and then use artificially low prices to gain market share, all without the existential pressure of needing immediate market-based rates of return for shareholders.
The state just underwrites the market risk entirely.
Exactly.
That kind of sustained support allows them to focus purely on engineering objectives and capacity growth without the usual constraint of quarterly earnings reports. Beyond these equity injections, what other financial advantages are they using to propel these firms into global contention?
They benefit from an extensive menu of financial incentives and favorable deals. This includes substantial corporate income tax exemptions or reductions, often spanning several years, and significant tax credits for R&D. Furthermore, they get preferential treatment in acquiring land, often through sales at dramatically reduced prices negotiated by subnational governments eager to attract a major fab.
Right.
And critically, there is a clear, direct connection between these government equity injections and the physical construction of new fabrication facilities across the country. This systemic approach guarantees that the financial commitment immediately translates into hard, physical manufacturing capacity.
And the most visible result of that direct investment connection is the staggering physical capacity building, particularly in these mature nodes where they can reach critical mass the fastest.
The sheer volume of capacity coming online is a powerful data point. Analysts suggest that China added more chip-making capacity than the rest of the world combined did in 2024. That represents an addition of over 1 million more wafers per month than they produced in 2023. This is industrial scaling on a breathtaking level.
And looking forward, is this place sustainable?
It's not just sustainable. The plan is accelerating. China is expected to construct or undertake major expansions on 26 new facilities between 2022 and 2026, leading the world in construction. For context, Taiwan, a core global player, expects 19 during the same period. This indicates a strategic commitment to overwhelming the market with scale.
But they are focusing this massive expansion overwhelmingly on legacy chips, those greater than 28 nanometers. Why is this mature node segment the central strategic focus rather than challenging the absolute leading edge?
It's a very shrewd, calculated strategy. By focusing on mature chips, they secure 2 major advantages. First, they can achieve self-sufficiency for vast domestic needs cars, home appliances, industrial control, military equipment, without relying on the highly restricted, specialized foreign technology required for 7mm or 5mm nodes. And second, their share of global mature node production is expected to soar, growing from 31% in 2023 to nearly 39% by 2027. The basis for their competitive advantage here is massive scale supported by state subsidization. This facilitates price-driven competition, not necessarily innovation-driven competition.
So they create a dependency on their low-cost supply.
Exactly. By dominating this larger node segment, they create external dependency through sheer market saturation and price advantage, while simultaneously ensuring their domestic mandates can be met regardless of geopolitical restrictions. It's a strategy that prioritizes resilience and market control over absolute technological superiority.
This massive capital build-out gives us a real-time indicator of success. Let's look at the equipment manufacturing side, Nora Technologies, to see that mandate turn into hard market share gains.
Nora Technologies is an excellent example of the immediate, tangible success of prioritizing these domestic champions. Nora manufactures critical semiconductor manufacturing equipment cleaning, deposition, etching tools. Following the expansion of trade controls, which restricted access to some foreign competitors, Nora exhibited just exceptional performance. Their revenue in the first half of 2024 increased by a staggering 46% year-on-year.
That kind of revenue acceleration is just not normal in the highly complex, multi-decade-to-develop equipment sector.
It shows the immediate impact of mandated local demand. Furthermore, Nora joined the world's top 10 largest semiconductor manufacturing equipment manufacturers in 2023, and it reached the 6th largest position globally by the first quarter of 2025.
Jumping 4 spots in a matter of months.
Yeah, it just illustrates how that dual combination of policy mandates and dedicated state funding can instantly accelerate a company's position in a highly complex global value chain. And overall, the indigenization rate for China's semiconductor manufacturing equipment SME industry reached 13.6%, up from just 7.2% in 2020. This shows the immediate, measurable impact of prioritizing domestic scaling through directed investment. You're effectively creating domestic champions who are now leveraging that scale to compete globally.
So we have thoroughly detailed China's highly centralized, capital-intensive, and mandate-driven model, a coordinated industrial engine focused on sovereignty through scale. Now let's turn our attention to the countermodel, specifically Europe, and how their focus on internal efficiency, free markets, and regulation has shaped their path toward what they call strategic autonomy.
The contrast here is genuinely stark, and this is where the difficulty for Europe lies. Where China has a centralized, unified national strategy backed by a singular, massive financial mechanism, the European Union's approach is inherently fragmented.
Right.
It has to balance a diverse set of competing interests across 27 member states, protecting its vast internal market, adhering to established global principles of free trade and competition, and safeguarding fundamental rights, all while trying to pursue technological leadership.
And their core stated goals, strategic autonomy and technological sovereignty, they reflect that complex balancing act. How does the EU define those terms, and how do they differ from China's simple goal of self-sufficiency?
Strategic autonomy is defined by the EU as the capacity to act autonomously when and where necessary and with partners wherever possible. And notice that emphasis on acting with partners. This is a diplomatic goal focused on independence of action, but always within a framework of international cooperation.
Okay, and technological sovereignty.
Yep. That's closer to China's goal, but framed differently. It's defined as control over its technological choices based on its own values and rules. This is crucial. The EU sees its power not just in manufacturing the chips, but in setting the global norms and standards for how that technology is governed and deployed. They view themselves primarily as a normative power, a global rule setter.
I see the distinction. China achieves sovereignty by building fabs and dominating physical capacity. Europe seeks sovereignty by writing the global operating manual. And since they can't mobilize the same scale of capital or unified mandated demand as China due to the structure of their internal market, the EU relies heavily on its regulatory toolkit to establish this normative power.
That's correct. The EU's main strategic tool is the creation of comprehensive regulatory frameworks designed to set global standards for technology usage. They essentially force global actors to comply if they want access to the lucrative European market. We see this in major initiatives like the Digital Decade Policy Program, which aims to foster digital resilience, competitiveness, and innovation across the member states through regulatory harmonization.
And in the hard tech space, they have the EU CHIPS Act.
The EU CHIPS Act is their explicit initiative to bolster domestic digital infrastructure and manufacturing capacity. It aims explicitly at technological sovereignty by attracting advanced foreign fabs like Intel and committing some funds to indigenous research. However, compared to the sustained decade-long flow of subsidies we saw earlier, the EU CHIPS Act is still inherently limited by internal market rules that restrict state aid and the creation of national champions.
Let's discuss the foundational governance pieces that are truly the EU's global calling card, the legislation that governs the digital economy.
These are their most powerful tools, based on the principle of leading by example through values. Key examples include the Data Governance Act, the DGA, which is a cross-sectoral tool designed to regulate the reuse of protected data held by public entities.
To encourage secure data sharing.
Exactly. And of course, the landmark Artificial Intelligence Act, the AI Act, which creates a risk-based legal framework for AI usage. These legislative efforts aim to converge the EU's competency in maintaining a unified internal market with its pursuit of technological sovereignty, all while upholding fundamental human rights and values like privacy and safety. This is the EU's unique strategy, leading the world through rules, not necessarily through proprietary technology or overwhelming scale.
But here is where we confront the central paradox, the efficiency trap. This very emphasis on balance, regulation, complexity, and efficiency, the comfortable cage we mentioned at the top, it appears to be leading to Europe's falling dangerously behind in hard technology capacity and scale, despite the clear strategy.
The data strongly suggests there is a cost associated with leading through regulation. Regulation is complex, it slays deployment, and it adds compliance costs that often hurt smaller, nascent European players more than the established global giants.
What are the tangible signs of this cost?
Well, we see clear evidence of strategic dependencies and a growing gap in digital capacity and adoption compared to the US and China. Look at connectivity, for instance. While 5G coverage across Europe is high, reaching about 81% of the population, the actual adoption rate tells a story of sluggish monetization.
Oh, sluggish.
Between 2021 and 2025, 5G mobile subscription growth in the EU lagged dramatically, rising only 3.6%. Contrast that with China's robust growth rate of 42.9% during the same period.
Wow, a nearly 40 percentage point difference in adoption. That massive difference in user volume means significantly fewer opportunities to generate data, fewer new business models developed,
and a slower, more fragmented digital transformation across the economy. And that deficit is compounded by an ongoing investment lag. If you look at telecommunication investment, the backbone of digital economies, Europe is simply being outspent.
Yeah.
In 2021, Europe spent 104 billion euros on telecom investment.
Okay.
The United States spent significantly more at 150 billion, and China was highly competitive at 110 billion euros. Without sustained capital deployment into physical infrastructure, speed and scale are impossible to achieve. The US and China are treating digital infrastructure as a priority utility. Europe treats it as a regulated market.
The cloud market is perhaps the most glaring example of a strategic dependency that highlights the weakness of relying on external efficiency. We outsourced cheap data storage and compute, and now we don't own the means of production.
Absolutely. The market share held by European cloud providers declined substantially, dropping from 26% to just 16% between 2017 and 2020. This leaves the entire massive foundational sector dominated by non-European actors, primarily American ones. This creates significant dependency on external infrastructure, raising serious concerns over data control, compliance with European values, and digital infrastructure resilience. We got the cheap, efficient service, but sacrificed control over our most critical digital asset, data.
And when we talk about innovation velocity, the ability to turn new ideas into large-scale commercial success, the unicorn count provides a stark measure of where the momentum truly lies.
It's the simplest metric of digital dynamism. As of early 2023, Europe had 249 unicorn startups valued over $1 billion. This is a good number, but look at the competition. There were 1,444 American unicorns and 330 based in China. The sheer dominance of American and Chinese corporations in high-growth digital markets is not just an economic rivalry. It translates directly into security concerns and risks to Europe's ability to fully control its digital choices and destiny.
This deficit highlights a core structural problem. Europe is excellent at regulating complex technology, but less effective at creating it and scaling it up quickly.
And that gets back to the bureaucratic overhead. The push for internal market harmonization is essential, but it is slow and complex. To implement a new EU-wide regulation like the AI Act requires 27 different national legislative bodies to adapt it, creating complexity that global competitors just don't face. This structure inherently favors companies that can afford massive legal and compliance teams, the existing non-European giants, over the nimble, highly innovative but small European startups.
So the efficiency that Europe prizes, free movement of goods, strong consumer protection, is counterbalanced by an internal inefficiency of governance and a regulatory burden that stifles the speed required for modern technological competition.
Precisely. The goal of sovereignty through regulation is noble, but it comes with a high cost in terms of speed and scale. And the result is seen in the projected adoption rates of advanced tools by existing businesses, the true engine of the European economy, particularly SMEs. Data suggests that only 20% of EU businesses will utilize artificial intelligence by 2030.
20% by 2030 seems remarkably slow given the global acceleration we are witnessing.
It is a sluggish rate, especially when you compare it to the United States, which already boasts twice as many SMEs incorporating advanced technologies like IoT, cloud, 5G, and AI today. This structural innovation gap suggests that Europe's path, while successfully emphasizing values and standards, risks locking the region into a state of structural digital dependency due to a failure to scale and accelerate technology adoption. They're perfectly regulating a market segment they increasingly don't dominate.
Let's circle back to China and examine the payoff for their intentional long-term subsidized strategy. Where has this focus on mandated domestic demand and massive scaling actually translated into measurable global competitiveness? Where did accepting that performance penalty today result in dominance tomorrow?
The results are most visible and successful in sectors defined by three factors: high capital intensity, a uniquely large and protected domestic demand base, and emerging technologies where global leaders were not yet definitively established.
Electric vehicles and new energy vehicles are the perfect global example of this state-directed success.
It's the textbook case. China mobilized years of financial support, massive R&D subsidies, and localization policies, creating a deeply protected and state-sponsored demand market. The result is global dominance. China's market share of the domestic EV market reached nearly 52% in 2023.
And the growth of companies like BYD is just astonishing.
Yes. Chinese firm BYD held almost 35% of the domestic NEV market in 2024. But the success extends far beyond just assembling the cars. It covers the entire supply chain. Chinese players account for approximately 85% of global battery cell production capacity and often lead technologically in the segment. This is a decade of sustained strategic funding and protected domestic demand transforming into undeniable global market dominance, the ultimate payoff for that optionality.
And we see a similar outcome in information and communication technology equipment thanks to those early and relentless buy Chinese mandates.
The policies fostering domestic ICT champions date back decades, supporting firms like Huawei and ZTE. Building on that foundation and leveraging the scale of mandatory domestic procurement, Huawei is now the world's largest equipment manufacturer, securing 35% of the global market share for 4G and 5G LTE base stations. This dominance was achieved by relentlessly leveraging a massive domestic market and continuous substantial state support, including direct government grants that more than tripled between 2021 and 2023 for a company like Huawei.
Finally, even in traditional large-scale industrial sectors like shipbuilding, they are using state capacity to target high-value niches.
China has strategically used state support to emerge as the world's largest shipbuilding country by order volume. Crucially, they have targeted high-tech, high-value segments previously dominated by Japan and South Korea. For example, China's share of highly complex LNG carriers, liquefied natural gas carriers, rose sharply to over 30% in 2024, up from only 7% in 2017.
A huge jump.
And furthermore, Chinese shipyards secured 74.7% of global orders in 2024 for green fuel-powered ships, showcasing their focused shift into high-growth, technology-intensive maritime areas.
This record of success in EV, ICT, and shipbuilding shows that the strategy works in sectors where scale and capital intensity are decisive. However, despite this progress, the ultimate goal of complete self-sufficiency remains incomplete. Where are the outstanding vulnerabilities at choke points where reliance on foreign firms persists?
Self-sufficiency at the absolute technological frontier is incredibly complex. It requires mastery over foundational intellectual property often developed over decades in the West. So vulnerabilities remain, often centered around highly specialized, complex tools and expertise.
And advanced semiconductors are still number one on that list.
Absolutely. For cutting-edge lithography, the manufacturing processes that print advanced chips at the transistor level, China remains critically reliant on foreign technology. The Dutch firm ASML remains the sole global supplier of extreme ultraviolet, or EUV, lithography machines, which are necessary for the most advanced nodes, 7 millimeters and below.
And they have a stranglehold on the older tech, too.
They do. ASML controls approximately 90% of the market for less advanced immersion deep ultraviolet machines, which are still required for many mature nodes. This singular reliance on a non-domestic supplier for the fundamental tool of modern chipmaking is a persistent and critical dependency.
The same dependency issue crops up in large-scale aerospace manufacturing, even with the prideful rollout of the domestic narrow-body jet, the COMAC C919.
The C919 is a national milestone, no doubt. It represents major progress in systems integration and airframe design. However, its supply chain reveals the depth of foreign reliance. Reports indicate the C919 relies heavily on foreign suppliers for critical, high-value systems. Components, power systems, and avionics, accounting for around 80% foreign or joint venture suppliers.
And the engine is still the key vulnerability.
Critically, yes. China is still dependent on foreign firms for state-of-the-art jet engine technology. That represents a major long-term vulnerability in the aerospace sector. Achieving self-reliance in aerospace requires not just assembling the plane, but mastering the underlying complex mechanical and thermal engineering of the engine.
And finally, the underlying tools needed for advanced R&D and complex industrial design, the critical software and specialized instruments, are still heavily dependent on external suppliers.
That's a dependency that often gets overlooked because it's not a physical chip or a plane, but it's foundational. China relies on foreign companies for over 90% of R&D industrial software. For instance, the market for computer-aided design, or CAD, which is essential for every engineer, is dominated by foreign firms like Dassault Systems and Siemens. Similarly, high-end scientific instruments, like electron microscopes used for material science and chip inspection, remain a vulnerability heavily dominated by foreign companies.
So dependence there limits the ability to rapidly accelerate indigenous innovation
and achieve full technological independence.
Now we arrive at a remarkable irony. The attempts by Western powers to limit China's progress through export controls and tariffs have actually resulted in an unintended boost to this self-sufficiency campaign. They've essentially lowered the competitive barrier for these domestic companies.
It's a classic case of an unintended feedback loop. The policies designed to stymie China's development have, contrary to their intention, accelerated the tech indigenization campaign. By restricting the sales of advanced American products, export controls effectively lowered the extremely high barrier historically posed by global market leaders like NVIDIA and Intel. This granted domestic Chinese companies like Huawei, in our Anhui example, a guaranteed protected opportunity to step in, scale their output, and rapidly improve their products.
And that strategic acceleration has caused measurable pain for the U.S. companies trying to compete globally.
Absolutely. Data from the U.S.-China Business Council confirmed this trend. 48% of survey respondents reported that export controls caused them to lose sales directly to Chinese competitors, and 30% lost sales to international competitors who were not subject to the same controls. This lack of international harmonization and controls just exacerbates the issue. Furthermore, there is a serious self-inflicted concern about the long-term competitiveness of U.S. chip manufacturers, 68% of whose sales come from non-U.S. sources. High tariffs and non-harmonized controls risk isolating these companies in a domestic Galapagos Island effect. If they can't access global scale and revenue, they lose the necessary funding base required to fuel the massive R&D needed for next-generation technology. The very act of trying to protect U.S. technology could undermine the global financial base required to keep that technology dominant.
So the core trade-off we observed at the very beginning, that Anhui office choosing the worst chip for a strategically superior reason, it's not an error. It's the operationalization of structural economic policy.
It is the ultimate embodiment of the central lesson we've learned. The Chinese state subordinates immediate economic efficiency and short-term growth to the overriding long-term strategic goals of independence and eventual dominance. And this approach is reinforced by rising geopolitical tensions, which makes strategic optionality, the ability to choose a domestic supplier, even if it's less efficient, far more valuable than simply achieving the cheapest, most streamlined option today. That determination to prioritize resilience over efficiency is the driving force that explains the market distortion we see.
This deep dive has shown that the decision observed in Anhui, choosing a technically worse product for a strategically superior reason, is not an isolated administrative glitch. It's a powerful reflection of a deep structural difference in strategic priorities. While one economic model prizes the frictionless optimization of global supply chains, the other intentionally pays a premium to guarantee domestic capacity.
The core tension is between a reliance on frictionless global efficiency, which is the comfortable, profitable cornerstone of the Western model, and the intentional, heavily subsidized creation of domestic strategic capacity, which defines the Chinese model. The Chinese strategy highlights that true technological leadership requires the courage and the capital to make choices beyond the immediately cheapest and most streamlined option, sacrificing short-term efficiency to secure long-term independence and strategic control over essential supply chains.
And that sacrifice is exactly what creates optionality. The strategic insight here is that in an era of geopolitical fracture, choosing dependency, even if cheap and efficient, is a decision with a rapidly escalating and ultimately unknown price tag.